But first, while the federal Labor government's fixated on demonising Peter Dutton's nuclear plans, outside the Canberra bubble, power bills only get higher, blackouts loom, jobs disappear and industries migrate offshore, along with working class jobs. So while Labor's playing politics, in the real world, the slow motion energy train wreck continues, especially in Victoria. Today, the Victorian Chamber of Commerce and Industry released a paper stating that the lack of gas-fired power to back up weather-dependent energy, quote, puts the whole entire east coast of Australia's energy security at risk. This is on top of warnings from the energy market operator last week of looming blackouts if the Iona gas storage in Western Victoria runs dry before the end of winter. The Chamber of Commerce report says that bans on gas exploration and extraction, plus bans on connecting gas to new homes, would cause, and I quote, the closure of manufacturing and other gas-reliant businesses, mass exodus to other states, or relocation offshore. It says that the state government's total focus on intermittent wind and solar power has produced, and I quote again, energy insecurity and unreliability, plus rising energy prices that leave local industry uncompetitive and limit new investment. And it's causing the loss of thousands of jobs. The Chamber of Commerce says that this is leading to a deepening of social economic disadvantage, as current policy settings benefit high-income earners who can afford solar panels, electric cooktops, EVs, batteries and heat pumps, and it excludes the low-income earners who are typically renters and who cannot afford these costly appliances. So much for Labor being on the side of the battler. Not anymore. Not under this hard left Prime Minister, who's more interested in courting the Greens than looking after Labor's traditional base. And with the typical hypocrisy of a party now focused on inner suburban elites, while Labor might publicly insist that the only way to save the planet is to festoon the country with wind turbines and solar panels, both the Victorian and New South Wales Labor governments are quietly subsidising coal-fired power just to keep the lights on. That's the madness of our current policy. We're subsidising wind and solar, forcing consumers to pay more to drive take-up, making the big players who invest in renewables richer, the foreign companies who own those assets richer, the Chinese manufacturers of turbines and solar panels richer, but ordinary Australians poorer. And then we're subsidising coal to keep the lights on because renewables can only ever, at best, do half the job. And as a result, both state and federal Labor governments are now subsidising households facing bill shock to avoid being wiped out at the ballot box. This is what happens when, for the past 15 years, we've run the power supply more to reduce emissions than to produce affordable and reliable electricity. Right now, federal Labor from Anthony Albanese down, well, they're all hyperventilating and demanding that Peter Dutton cost his plan for 7 emissions-free nuclear power stations. Yet 2 years into government, with all the resources of office, 250,000 public servants at their beck and call, Labor still hasn't costed its own so-called green transition. It insists that nuclear power is impractical, too expensive, potentially too dangerous, and will take too long. Now, quite rightly, last night here on Credlin, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott called that out.
This idea that we can't do nuclear when at least 33 other countries do, it's ridiculous. This idea that nuclear is somehow unsafe when we've had a nuclear reactor at Lucas Heights within a stone's throw of backyards for 60 years, that's ridiculous. This idea that somehow we can't have nuclear on land when we're going to get it at sea, that's ridiculous. This idea that nuclear would take too long when, hell, we've got this Snowy 2.0, which is going to take more than a decade to bring to fruition, and where the costs have blown out from 2 billion to 12 billion plus. Again, all of the arguments used against nuclear don't stand up.
As even the Energy Minister Chris Bowen has admitted, cutting coal-fired power back from the current 60% of our power generation to under 10% in just 6 years is our own version of an industrial revolution. Yet it was the government's own regulator, AEMO, that belled the cat this week, saying that Australia was way behind schedule on these ambitious, indeed fanciful plans. Still, we've got Chris Bowen insisting that we need to have 82% of our total electricity coming from renewables by 2030, 6 years away. Bowen, the same bloke that blew up our borders when he was Immigration Minister, well, he was the people smugglers' best friend, and now he's sending us broke. We have got to wake up here. No country on earth is attempting this transition this fast and this hard. The recent Net Zero Australia study involving 3 premier universities, headed up by a former chief scientist, put the cost of getting to net zero without nuclear power, given all the firming and unavoidable overbuild of infrastructure needed, at an eye-watering $1.5 trillion by 2030. Former Labor Minister, head of the new Net Zero Authority, Greg Combay, well, he's even admitted that the government's plans will cost, and I quote, hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet somehow in Labor's view, it's the opposition that's got a costings issue. By admitting that there's no cheap way to get to net zero and advocating for the only form of power that can get us there and keep the lights on, Dutton has finally injected some overdue honesty into the energy debate. Not so Chris Bowen, though, who had this to say in question time this afternoon.
I read that bipartisan, respected commentator in The Australian this morning, Peta Credlin, pointing out, arguing that the Leader of the Opposition has turned the energy debate on its head. Said Dutton turns energy debate on its head. And I've got to say, I don't always agree with Peta Credlin, but I thought she hit the nail on the head this morning, Mr Speaker, because the Leader of the Opposition has turned the energy debate on its head by arguing that the way to reduce bills is to introduce the most expensive form of energy available, nuclear.
Good try, Minister, but if you want to quote me, get it right. Read beyond the headline in The Australian, otherwise you just underscore the fact that you're a dill. Here is what I actually wrote. Finally, Dutton has injected a note of realism into the debate by offering an alternative that reduces emissions without jeopardising the security of supply. The government's response, asinine cartoons about deformed fish and the rushed appointment of a turncoat Liberal to a supposedly independent climate authority, shows just how debauched our public debate has become. Because the government can't demand Dutton's costing without also producing its own. We might finally be able to make some energy decisions based on rational judgment rather than green religion. But, Chris Bowen, I tell you what, I encourage you to keep reading my columns, perhaps even listening to this show. We can only hope, can't we, that you might actually learn something before it's too late.